Hello and welcome to the lecture on death, social beliefs, and rituals. In this lecture, what we're going to be going over are aspects of death, how it can express kinship, how we can come to know life through the rituals that we participate in, and also what an important aspect it is for us to discuss and engage in, seeing as we are members of a community and that the death rituals themselves do have a lot of social cohesive ability. So when we're talking about death, often it is discussed in terms of being something that most of us know. It's something that we don't really want to engage in, but we feel as though we know what death is and when death in fact has occurred. So in order to be able to understand death, we need to first describe and secure a working understanding of the material features that make us feel as though we in fact do know death. So in Western society, I want you guys to think about some of the ways in which we come to know that a death has occurred. So how is it that you find out that someone that you know, someone you went to school with, or a loved one has passed away? Nowadays, it seems that most individuals hear about death through social media. The speed at which we hear about the passing of an individual is very, very quick now. There are cases and news stories that we hear about where, mothers are finding out that their daughter has passed away in an automobile accident through the posting of her friends on Facebook. We log on to Facebook, Twitter, whatever the social media is, and we hear about individuals we went to school with who've passed away, or friends of theirs, or their parents. And so social media has become a big kind of communicator of death to all of us. Now, it is still a new landscape for us to navigate around, so we haven't really learned how to appropriately memorialize individuals, how to appropriately engage in, people who are mourning. How do you, console them? How do you speak to them? What can you do for them, especially if you're doing things for them through this social media format. So social media, absolutely one of the ways that most of us hear about a death nowadays. It used to be that individuals would phone someone and let them know, or they would stop by their house and inform people, or you would hear about it in passing on the street, meeting someone at a grocery store and hearing about, someone passing away that you played hockey with or figure skated with. So death is now verbally communicated to us. It's communicated through social media. We can read about it in the papers or hear about it in the news. So hearing about death is one thing. What is it that we do in terms of reacting to this news? So what kind of actions do individuals take? So the actions that individuals take, symbolically and physically, are often mediated through material goods. And so through rituals of mourning and remembrance, we offer of ourselves and of these material goods in order to solidify, in some cases, new social narratives. We access the individuals who are mourning to let them know that they are not alone, that people will be there to support them, to help them kind of rebuild, repair, and to move forward, or at the very least stabilize themselves. So reactions that people will take are obviously grief, crying, anger. There are people who most definitely feel anger at the news of the passing of someone. People will bring food to the household, so knowing that the individuals are going to be experiencing a lot of people stopping by to visit, to say hello, whatever it is. So bringing over casseroles or snacks, things that they're able to share with people without having to kind of take themselves away from what is going on in order to prepare this food, and of course participating in the funeral itself. So when we're looking at death and trying to understand it a little bit better, there is one thing that individuals must absolutely be in possession of before they can be regarded as being deceased. Now, this is something I want you guys to think about. So what is it that a person must have before they can be declared dead? Now, it's not a trick question, but it is something that's very important to the study of death. The thing that they must be in possession of is a life. In order for there to be an absence of life, obviously life must first be declared and also socially recognized. So though not usually spoken of in explicit terms, life is an essential component if death is in fact to occur. So life is not only essential to death, but the discourse surrounding life also helps to define what type of a death has occurred. In our society, we have an understanding of a proper life course. And so we have this narrative that tells us that we should live until the age of approximately 75 to 80 years old. During that lifetime, you should go through different rites of passage in different stages. So you should graduate, you should get married, you should have a good job, have kids, grandkids, and retire. And then at the age of 75 or 80, ideally what should happen is you go to bed one night, you fall asleep, and you don't wake up. If we break script at any point, meaning that we don't fulfill that proper life course and someone's taken away from us too soon, then we react with a lot of anger. And it isn't just the family that will react in anger, it can be the society as a whole as well. And so we need to know what kind of a life did these individuals have? Did they fulfill that proper life course or not? And that will help us determine whether or not the death that they suffered was a good death, or if it was a bad death. So for right now, we'll get into good and bad deaths a little bit later in the lecture, but for right now, the important feature to take away from this is that in order to suffer a death, you must first be socially recognized as having been born and having been in possession of this life. So once in possession of life, a biological and social entity begins to be constructed. As we've covered throughout this course, we are enculturated, we are socialized to become moral members of a community. And so people impart onto us aspects of the values, aspects of what it means to be good, what it means to be a hard worker, what the values of the community itself are. The best way to think about this is it's as though we are onions, and these layers of the onion are kind of added or built up around us as we age. So once we're determined to be alive, then this social entity begins to be constructed. So if we're talking about someone who's alive, someone who's in possession of life, when they do pass away, do you think that it is, or the way we should think about this, is that death is an event? Or rather, is death in fact a process? So when we're talking about death, is death in fact an event, or should it more accurately be thought of as being a process? So when we're talking about death, death most certainly should be thought of as being a process and not an event. In writing on why this is so, Robert Hertz states, where a human being is concerned, the physiological phenomenon are not the whole of death. To the organic event is added a whole set of complex mass beliefs, emotions, and activities. Just as we construct individuals through our interactions with them, so must we deconstruct them over time. And so it takes a while for us to kind of peel back the layers of that onion and to come to terms with the passing of this individual, because it isn't just one interaction that we are having with them. We're trying to come to terms with multiple layers or levels of the relationship that we had with them. So you need to be in possession of life in order for you to suffer a death, and death needs to be thought of as a process and not an event. So we're going to look at some theoretical influences to death. The first two we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but the next two we most definitely are going to really kind of delve into. I just wanted you to be familiar with early evolutionary approaches to the study of death. So E.B. Tylor, you might recall from early lectures where we talked about his approach to society and to culture. Now, E.B. Tylor and Fraser and other academics at this time were doing what's referred to as evolutionary anthropology, or had an evolutionary approach. Basically, they were going around trying to find the origins of everything, origins of culture, origins of religion. And their belief was if they could find the most primitive form of religion, then they could find a start point. And from that start point, what they would do is they would map out other examples that they had in a linear fashion, and that they would find the most advanced form more often than not being Western society. Now, this linear approach to evolution and ranking people in terms of whether they are advanced or primitive is not used in anthropology today, but it was definitely quite popular early on. E.B. Tyler was an individual who was using this evolutionary approach. And so he was trying to find out the origin of religion. And what he believed is that early thinkers would surmise that there's a difference between individuals who were in an awake state and individuals who were in a sleep, death, or trance state. And what he thought the early thinkers would reason is that there was an animating force inside the body that would leave it at times. Now, this animating force would leave the body and it would travel to basically, the best way to think about this is almost like a holding pen. So this animating force would leave the body, it would travel to this holding pen where it would remain until it returned back to the body. So the difference between someone who was awake and someone who was asleep was that the person who was awake had the animating force inside of him. The person who was asleep did not have the animating force in them. It was over in this holding pen. He thought that early thinkers would reason that at some point this animating force would leave the body and would just stay in that holding pen, in that heaven, in that spiritual realm, however you want to think about it, and it would not return back to the body. But because this animating force had once been connected to the person, and the person had been connected to the group itself could call upon this animating force at times in order to help them overcome issues that they were having, or to help explain things that were going on. Why are our crops failing? What can we do about this? And so this early thinking in terms of souls, E.B. Tyler thought, came from watching or reasoning about the difference between people who were awake and people who were asleep. Now, Fraser was an individual who wrote a collection called The Golden Bough, and we're not going to spend too much time on him, but basically he thought that funeral rituals, the ones that he had assembled anyways, were coming about because of the fear that early individuals had of the corpse itself, and also them trying to come to terms with the belief in souls and also the afterlife. And so he thought that these rituals were there to help us deal with the corpse. It would give us things that we could do to overcome this fear that we had. And also the rituals themselves, the funeral rituals, would allow us to kind of solidify in our thinking the existence of the soul and also the existence of the afterlife. Now, the two individuals who we're going to spend more time on are Emile Durkheim and Robert Hertz. Now, Emile Durkheim we've already experienced in the course. Emile Durkheim was talking in terms of totems, about moral communities and the importance of rituals. So Durkheim was influenced by the organizational aspects of death in society. He looked to the rituals themselves to see if he could find examples of the participants actually building moral communities through the things that they were doing. And I'll explain this a little bit more in just a second. But I want to give you kind of a preview of Robert Hertz. So Robert Hertz is a student of, or was a student of, Emile Durkheim's, and he focused on aspects of secondary burial in the remote cultural area of Borneo. Now, secondary burial is quite simply, you would have a primary burial where an individual would be placed into the ground or would be placed into a clay vase, and they would be left there until the wet aspects of their body had deteriorated, leaving only the bones. After a certain period of time, the bones would then be dug up or removed from this clay pot, they would be cleansed, ritually blessed, dressed, whatever it is, and then another ceremony would take place. And Robert Hertz thought that the time that passed between the first or the primary burial and the secondary burial was very important because it allowed the society itself to repair. It allowed them time to overcome this absence, to overcome any distress that the loss of this person may have caused. So we're going to look at Emile Durkheim first in a little bit better detail, and then we will move on to Robert Hertz. So in Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Emile Durkheim argues that the most important aspects of funerary rituals is the reaffirmation of cohesive social bonds and structures. Durkheim's view of society was such that it was a moral community whose values are expressed as collective representations. And for Durkheim, it was very important that the values of this moral community be expressed as collective representations through rituals. And the funeral ritual was one of the best ways to do this. So what he is basically saying is we learn what it means to be a member of this society by participating in these rituals and hearing certain things and experiencing them as well. So when we go to a funeral and we see a mother wailing in grief at the loss of her child, we know what the role of a mother involves. It involves sacrifice, it involves pain, it can involve loss. When we see a father at a funeral behaving in a very kind of stoic manner, he is mourning the loss of his child, but he has to be strong. He has to support his family members. We learn what this role involves, or at least what the expectations are socially of this role. So again, we're learning the values of the society, and we're learning it through these collective representations in the form of the funeral rituals. For Durkheim, he believed that an individual's soul was only a portion of the group's soul. And he thought that basically individuals would understand or would come to believe that they could live forever. Because if your soul is only a portion of the group soul, and if the group survives even when an individual dies, that stands as proof that that individual's life or soul must have the same perpetuity. Meaning that if the group continues on and you are made up of the same stuff as the group, then you will also continue on. You may be in an altered state, but you will continue on. So the way that we witness the group moving on, continuing, society kind of, trods along, even though we lose people along the way, allows us to believe that we will have this immortality in the same way that society is seen to have it. Durkheim believed that social feelings can be stabilized and intensified through the use of symbols, and that these symbols and the rituals that we participate in help solidify communal bonds. So for Durkheim, participation in funerary rituals can stem from a sense of moral obligation. And even though it stems from a sense of moral obligation, importantly to the individual and to the group as well, participation in these funeral rituals can serve to further an understanding of what it means to be a good and proper member of the group. So he sees funerary rituals as being very, very positive to a society because it reaffirms the cohesive social bonds and structures and allows for the expression of the values contained within that moral community. Now, Robert Hertz, again, was a student of Durkheim's, and he focused in his work on the entangled interplay between social phenomena and the psychological and biological determinants of death. In Death in the Right Hand, Hertz explores aspects of death rites with a strong focus on secondary burial. Through his analysis of the meanings put onto life itself, dying and death, he mapped out social practices and communal understandings that were dependent on the relationship between the state of the body, the fate of the soul, and the individuals and survivors who were bound by various socially imposed taboos and restrictions. So in his analysis, what he does is he maps out how social practices and communal understandings relate to the state of the body, in that the fate of the soul of the individual is being governed by the state of the body, as is the state of the living individuals and the mourners. So what he was doing in his triangle is he's basically saying when an individual initially dies and their body is relatively intact, the living and the mourners are very closely connected to the corpse itself. And so they're more closely bound to the realm of the dead than they are to the land of the living. And that as the body begins to break down, the hold that the corpse has on them, or that death has on them, begins to lessen, begins to weaken. And so as the body deteriorates, so too does that bonding, meaning that individuals can go back to their daily routines and they're not as strictly bound by, funeral rituals or whatever it is. They've lost some of the pollution that death itself can bring upon people. The other thing that he states is that when the body is relatively intact, the soul of the individual is thought to be very, very close to it as well. And so that we need to ritually treat the body in order to not only release ourselves, but to release the soul of that deceased individual. So in Borneo, when he was looking at secondary burials, when individuals were in the primary burial stage, there was a lot of taboos and restrictions that were placed on close relatives of this deceased individual. And it was not until the secondary burial had taken place that they could be released from these restrictions. So during the time between the primary and the secondary burial, relatives of a deceased individual could be completely dependent on the society to help meet all their needs, cooking food, getting water, taking away waste, cleaning their clothes, all these different sorts of things. They would have taboos and restrictions would say that they couldn't do these things. And so the members of the community would have to step forward and help them. Now, what Hertz realized is that while the relatives of this deceased individual were so dependent upon the society, they were also recognizing that while they're feeling the absence of this person who's passed away, they still have all these other individuals who are there to help them. So it kind of revealed to them that society will continue on, things will continue on. And while you're feeling pain right now, we're going to be there to support you, we're going to be there to help you. And so Hertz is basically demonstrating that, it allows us to see in a way society itself as being immortal, and to also recognize that society can transcend the lives of the individual members who make it up. And he looked at death also and said, death transforms not only the living and the mourners, but obviously transforms the person who passes away. They go from being just, regular, everyday living members of a society to becoming ancestors, to having quite a different status. And that this is very important in terms of seeing death and its transformative qualities in a more positive life. When he's talking about the body itself, he says the body itself is so very important in terms of symbolism. We don't treat deceased human individuals as though, we're handling the carcass of a non-important animal. We believe that specific care must be given, and we turn to, nowadays, religious or medical specialists in order to do this. And he said that, some practices initially people believed came about because of this narrative of it being hygienic requirement. But he said most of the things that we do have evolved out of moral social obligations. The body of a deceased individual is initially a symbolic repository of pollution and danger, and it must ritually be treated in such a way that it can be reintroduced back into society in a more positive form. And we can do this by embalming, we can do this through cremation. We can do this through burial, but we need to have a ritual aspect that is tied to this as well. As the moral obligations surrounding the deceased individuals affect the immediate family, they can also be said to have impact on the social consciousness at large as well. And so Hertz is really speaking to the fact that, well, the death of an individual may impact the immediate family. Ultimately, it affects all of us. And so it really ties into the work of Durkheim as well, where, Hertz is talking about social consciousness and Durkheim is speaking to collective representation. The thing to take away from both of these is that they're looking at how these rituals can allow us to repair, rebuild, and to, in some cases, make stronger our connection to the community or to the social group. And Hertz, I will leave this section with him, with a quote from Hertz, where he says, "Death, by striking the individual, has given him a new character. His body, which was in the realm of the ordinary, suddenly leaves it. It can no longer be touched without danger. It has in fact become the object of horror and dread. And because of this, we need to ritually transform it. And as we ritually transform it, we can come to the conclusion that the individual soul has been ritually transformed and that also society itself has been ritually transformed." So main conclusions to take away from Hertz. Hertz believed that death was a process. We should not think of it as being the instantaneous destruction of an individual's life. Just as it took time for us to build up this individual, it's going to take us time to dismantle them. Death should be thought of as a social event. It's the starting point of a ceremonial process whereby the dead individual becomes an ancestor. And so we're seeing the transformation of the person. And as they are transformed again, so too is the society. And that death should most importantly be understood as an initiation into a social afterlife. And this seems rather foreign to us in a North American or Canadian understanding. We don't view death as being a rite of passage or an initiation, but it really is. And so he says death is like an initiation into a social afterlife, making it a kind of rebirth for the person. And we can really see that through a lot of the funeral rituals that we do in fact have. So when we're looking at death and trying to understand if a good death has happened or a bad death has happened, before we can really break that apart, we need to understand that there's more than one type of death that in fact can occur. Now this is a really limited list in terms of explaining to you guys the different types of death that people can have, and there's overlap between the categories, but they're strong enough on their own that we should discuss each one as kind of a standalone type of death. So a biological or a physical death can be broken down into a natural good death or an accidental death, which can be good or bad, and we'll look at how that can happen. So a natural or a good death follows after a proper life course has been lived. In narratives, it is described as a long life lived followed by death during sleep, or at the very least a quick death where the individual did not have time to realize that they were going to die and they were not in pain. Accidental deaths can be either good or bad. Now, what can change our understanding of a death as being good and shift it towards being bad, can be the age of the person, can be the circumstances surrounding this death. So this is the type of death that is tied to medical death as well, due to improvements in first responder techniques and emergency room techniques. Deaths which would have happened on roadways are now being held off, right? First responders are keeping people alive now, and we are then having to deal with, are they really alive or are they not? So people who would have passed away due to an automobile accident and have suffered a whole brain death are being kept alive artificially. And this has caused us as a society to have to start to think in terms of what is life? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be a person? Where do we think the self exists? In North American or Western understanding, we tend to lean towards personhood existing in the brain. And so the brain becomes this focus area. And we say that if someone suffers an injury to their brain, even if the brain stem is still functioning, if someone has an upper brain injury, we will talk in terms of them no longer being alive. So while their body could biologically still be functioning, we will say that the person is no longer there anymore. And organ transplantation, of course, has caused us to also have to think about this. We're talking about an accidental death and how it can be good or bad. Like I said, it can depend on the type of the accident or the age of the person. So for example, the death of a 20-year-old who has died as the result of a motor vehicle accident. Now, if we find out that the individual was drinking, if we find out that the individual was texting and driving, that initially will start off as being a bad death. Now, of course, through the funeral rituals, we can reconfigure that narrative and make it into a good death. When I was in high school, in grade 12, one of my classmates passed away drinking and driving, and it was close to graduation time. And so while her death was initially spoken of as though it was a bad death, she was far too young, there was drinking involved, what happened is that individuals started to say that she in fact had died so the rest of us could be saved, so we would know not to drink and drive. So she had been in a way sacrificed for the betterment of the group, or for the whole group. And so you can see how we can reconfigure these things. We will use funeral rituals and mourning as a way to do this. But we have the death of an individual who dies because of drinking and driving. That's seen to be a bad death. We don't view that individual as being a hero. But let's say this 20-year-old individual is a soldier and dies fighting, in Afghanistan, trying to defend freedom there. That person immediately is seen to be a hero. And while, of course, not an ideal death, is definitely seen to have had a good death because he was defending freedoms, he was defending values which we hold to be important. Now, social death. The social death is basically a form of death that is thought to occur or should occur before a biological death occurs in the proper life course narratives. So social death should happen before biological death occurs. So it is a death of the social individual as expressed through social relationships. Examples of individuals who can be thought of as having experienced a social death are seniors in care facilities, unresponsive individuals, so for example someone in a coma, or individuals who have been shunned from society due to disease or other conditions that are deemed to be dangerous to the social unit as a whole. So we have this again, proper life course in North America: live until you're 80, pass away in your sleep. What happens as you start to age is that you move from being the center of your social group out to the margins of it. So picture a tapestry or a weaving, and at the start of your life, you're right in the center, and people kind of come to you and they come to your house. The way to think about this is the switchover that can happen for people. So let's say that your grandmother's house was the place where everyone would go every Thanksgiving or every Christmas for a meal. And then as she gets older, what happens is either your mother or your aunt or your uncle take on that responsibility. And so you no longer go to your grandmother's house because she's downsized. She's, going into a smaller and smaller place until she's eventually in a care home. And so you go to your aunt's or your uncle's place, and they become kind of the center of your family. They're the rock that holds everyone together. And your grandmother, who used to be the focal point, now is the individual who's brought in as a visitor. And so the roles that she had in your social group over time are eventually cannibalized by the rest of the group. And so you have a cousin who takes on, learning how to make mashed potatoes like Grammy used to make them. You have grandkids are trying to learn how to make cinnamon buns like she did. And all these things that she used to do are now being handed off to the group. And we do this because obviously we want to continue traditions, but also it fits into our belief that this social death should happen before the biological death. Because if someone can socially die before they biologically die, the disruption to the group is minimized. So if grandma had died while she was at the center of the group, think about a big bunch of the threads being pulled out of that tapestry. Basically, the whole thing is going to fall apart. But as grandma starts to suffer this social death, her thread grouping moves from the center out and out and out until she's basically on the edge of the tapestry or the edge of the weaving. So when she passes away, those threads just fall off of the tapestry, fall off of the weaving. And while we do experience pain and understand kind of the suffering of loss, it doesn't disrupt us in the same sort of way it would if the individual had not had that social death before the biological death had happened. Religious death. Now, religious death can be thought of as a social death, but basically what a religious death is it's the death that occurs when an individual decides to separate themselves from a religious group by not following the traditional religious beliefs or by removing themselves entirely from the community. Examples of this can be given from Amish or Hutterite communities, where an individual who has decided to deny communal beliefs and traditions has been cut off from the social group. The degree to which this occurs can vary, and it can range from group members having limited contact with the person who has left to them believing, for all intents and purposes, that the person who has left is in fact deceased. I've heard examples of funerals being held for individuals who have left these religious groups. So you really are thinking this person no longer is in existence. You don't have any social relationship with them at all. And that is what religious death is. Now, a medical death can either be good or bad. This is the death that most of us are familiar with. 76% of us will experience death within the medical realm itself. It used to be that within the household, now it's within the medical realm. So it can refer to physical death that occurs within a medical facility, or to death such as full brain death that is declared within the medical facility. Medical death is the most contested type of death. And the main reason for this is organ transplantation and trying to determine when life has ceased to exist, even when, or especially when, the biological aspects of the person can continue on or can be seen to be continuing on. So someone who's being kept alive artificially, or someone who has enough brainstem function that their body is still able to maintain respiration, blood circulation, basic things that we need to maintain ourselves, but they don't seem to have any awareness. They don't have any consciousness, and so we're stuck in a place where we're trying to determine, are they actually dead? We know biologically they're obviously presenting themselves as being alive, but that isn't enough, and we're uncomfortable with that. We need to know, is the person still there? So again, medical death is very, very difficult to determine, and it is the most contested type of death that there is, especially when you're talking about permanent vegetative individuals, permanent vegetation state individuals. Individuals who are no longer mentally capable of having a sentient existence. We talk about a quality of life and try and use that in order to help make these determinations. But it's very, very difficult for us to be able to do that. And there is a really good book, if this is of interest to you, talking about organ transplantation and the reinvention of death. Margaret Lock wrote a book called Twice Dead: Organ Transplantation and the Reinvention of Death, and she'll take you through step by step, talking about movements that have happened, different technologies that kind of forced our hands in reconsidering when death has occurred, when life has ended, or it's ended enough that we would feel comfortable in doing organ transplants or the harvesting of the organs themselves. So Margaret Lock, absolutely brilliant anthropologist, and I highly, highly recommend Twice Dead if you can find a copy of that. Now, death as a rite of passage. We've covered Arnold van Gennep, and we've mentioned how Hertz is speaking about death as being a rite of passage. We should think of it in terms of it being a rebirth of the individual. So it fits that Arnold van Gennep also explored death, and he thought that in terms of the funerals themselves, the element of separation would be the least important aspect involved in the ritual itself. So most people think that when the death occurs, that's the most striking moment, right? The separation between the living and this now deceased individual, and that it would be the thing that they would focus on in terms of the rituals. But Van Gennep, through his work, found out that actually it was the liminal or the transitional phase which actually dominates mortuary rituals and the symbolism behind them. So with Arnold van Gennep and the rites of passage, what he found is that this liminal phase, or this betwixt and between, allows us a space to reconfigure the narrative of a deceased individual, and also we can use this space to reconfigure our perceived relationship to them as well. And I see this happening in roadside memorials, and also social media memorials for individuals, where people will say, even though I didn't really know you in life, you were my true love, or you were my best friend, or you were my soulmate. And people tend not to contest that. And what is happening is the individual is reconstructing their biography. They're basically saying that this deceased individual had a greater connection to them. I've had individuals who have said, even though you didn't want to have a relationship with me, you would have been, the perfect husband, you would have been a great father to my children, and so I'm raising them knowing who you were, meaning that this individual is now going to fulfill the father role within that family, teaching the kids how to play guitar, teaching them about the individual, as well as though this individual was the father to them. And I've had also in funeral rituals where obviously the deceased individual's biography has been changed. So in one case, an individual had passed away because of a motor vehicle accident. Drinking was involved in it. This person was using or was known to use drugs on a fairly regular basis and had a kind of carefree life at the end of his life. Now, at the funeral itself, the individual, the way the family was speaking about them, was a highly religious person. He believed in God and trusted in Christ and the scripture so much that he went so far as to sleep with the Bible under his pillow. So totally almost whitewashing the reality of that individual's life at the end of their existence, and taking this liminal period through the mortuary rituals to reconstruct who this person was. So presenting them as though they were pious, presenting them as though they were Christian, as though they were saintly in a way, I guess is the best way to state it. So I agree with Van Gennep that it is this liminal or transitional phase which seems to be the most important part of looking at death as a rite of passage. So if we're talking about death as a rite of passage, as you know, there are the three stages: the separation, where you are removed from the main body of the group; the liminal or transitional phase, where you are imparted with new knowledge, which will help solidify you with this new identity once you are reintegrated back into the group. So when you come back into the society, do you come back with a changed identity? And through the ritual itself, whose identity has been changed? Is it the mourner's identity that has been changed, or is it the deceased individual? Here you have two pictures in front of you. One is of a soldier and one is of a deceased soldier. Now, one of these individuals is spoken of as though they are a hero. And which individual is it that we are more comfortable stating that they are a hero? Is it the living soldier, or is it the deceased soldier? In this case, it is the same person. But as Hertz was saying, death, by striking the individual, changes their very character. We can see that death as a rite of passage has given this person a new identity. And not only did Chad have a new identity, he went from being just this average soldier to being a hero, so too did his family. Now they are the parents of this Canadian hero. There's a lot of tributes to him. I believe there's a school that named a playground after him. All these different things that happen because of his death. So death is very powerful, and also obviously the rituals of death are very powerful, not only to the deceased individual, but to the community as well. So we're going to look at Philip Aries' understandings of the different types of death that have existed at different periods in our history. He wrote a work called Western Attitudes Towards Death, a very kind of short little book that summarizes the larger work that he did called The Hour of Our Death. And in both of these works, he breaks down different understandings that have occurred again at different points in our history. So he says the tame death occurred up to about the 12th century. During this tame death period, individuals had a resignation to the collective destiny of the species, and so death wasn't feared. All individuals knew and understood that we shall all die. Individuals believed that they were going to be forewarned of their death, and that the warning would come in the form of natural signs or inner convictions rather than through supernatural or magical premonition. And so individuals believed that they would see a sign in nature, or that they would just know themselves internally that it was their time to die. And when it was their time to die, the individual would, according to what Aries had found in writings and paintings and different expressions from this time. An individual, knowing that death shouldn't be feared and that we all shall die, would prepare for their death. They would lay on the ground and face heaven, or they would gather people around them, divide their possessions, impart last bits of wisdom, and then take their last breath. A dying individual's chamber was a public space that was to be entered into freely. It wasn't something that you would avoid for fear of, imposing upon the privacy of the individual. It was something that you would actively want to participate in. The souls of deceased individuals were thought to ascend to heaven through the prayers of others. So it didn't have to do with things that you had done throughout the course of your life. The individual on their own was not seen to be important. The individual as a member of the group was more important. And so the way that you would ascend to heaven is not through your own good deeds, but in the recognition of other individuals who would pray for you, and their prayers would lift you to heaven. And so people ideally wanted to be buried as close as they could to the altar in the church, because as people prayed to the altar in the church, these prayers would again help to lift you up into heaven. And we see at this time that individual grave markers were not overly important. So that's why you see a lot of these mass burials or mass graves, especially in church courtyards or in the churches themselves. Identifying the individual was not important. You just needed to have a community praying for you, and that was all it would take for you to get to heaven. Now, one's own death, Philip Aries says, occurs between the 12th and the 16th century. We start to see the emergence of the importance of self. Death scarcely touches the living anymore to warn them. And so now people are starting to be shocked by death. They're no longer having this inner conviction. People move away from having this collective destiny of the species where we believe that we all shall die. There starts to be a heightened concern for the individuality of the person. The Last Judgment and the Second Coming enter into the narratives, and the Last Judgment is linked to that of individual biography. And so instead of the group praying for you and that being enough, now you have to worry about the things that you did in your life. Were you a good person? How is that going to affect you? Bedchamber scenes in artistic representations begin to show dying individuals surrounded by people who have expressions of mild anxiety on their faces. People kind of scrambled to atone for their sins before they died, for fear that if they didn't, they would not ascend to heaven, or they would not have this kind of peaceful death. Instead of the individual dividing their stuff, their property, and imparting wisdom to individuals around them, wills start to be used in order to divide inheritance. So man has come to see himself in his own death at this time, and it's causing him anxiety. Headstones at this time, because individual grave markers start to become more important, headstones will say, "As you are, I once was. As I am, you shall be." So trying to remind individuals, be careful in your life. Make sure you're wrapping up affairs, or, saying the right things to people, atoning for your sins. And that death is most definitely going to happen. So thy death occurs between the 16th and 18th century. We start to see death as though it is in fact raping the living and ripping them away from their lives. In the 18th century, death is no longer tame. Activities that surround death are treated as though they occurred spontaneously, and that they are inspired by intense sorrow and passions. The community itself has a new intolerance to the separation that death brings. The very idea of death begins to move us, because we're starting to reflect on it in terms of us being an individual and us no longer existing. Wills become legal documents. They're no longer just social documents. Death is no longer a concern only for the individual who is experiencing it. Death starts to affect the family and the community as well. Death and mourning become constrained to the realm of close family and friends. It's no longer seen to be the public affair that it was during the 12th century during the tame death. Tombs and headstones begin to serve as signs of the person's presence after death. The tombs and the headstones begin to represent a form of immortality and become very important in kind of social consciousness or social thinking. Cemeteries, which used to be at the center of the towns themselves and would be used as parks and playgrounds and areas where you would go have a picnic, cemeteries are no longer seen to be these positive places. They are moved from the center of towns out to the margins or out to the farthest reaches of the city. And so we're losing this kind of idea of there being a city of the dead or a necropolis that is a reflection of the city of the living. We want to move death away from the center, out as far as we can, away from our consciousness. In the forbidden death or the invisible death, that's from the 18th century up until the present. Death itself has become shameful and forbidden. We have thinking now which suggests to us that death is a condition that can be cured, especially when you think in terms of the Western attitudes towards the body, viewing it as though it is a machine made up of parts, and these parts can be replaced at times. We are creating this kind of a consciousness or this kind of thinking which tells us, all we need to do is figure out the right combination of body part replacements, the right medicine or tweak the cells this way rather than this other way, and we can live forever. Death is seen to be a failure of the society itself. We don't want individuals to die, and we go out of our way to ensure that, they live as long as possible. And we seem to have lost sight of, quality of life. We want the quantity over the quality. There's a desire on the part of medical specialists to spare the sick and dying individuals of the burden of their ordeal. So many medical specialists do not reveal to the individuals themselves the true physical state that they are in. In fact, they will talk around it and they will speak in more positive terms, even though they know that that doesn't really reflect the physical condition that the person is in. Death occurs because society has failed to overcome it. Hospitals have become places where individuals struggle against death. Hospitals historically used to be places of shelter and places of healing, but now we see them as though they are negative. Death is thought of as though it is a technological phenomenon that needs to be determined by a doctor or a hospital team. Death has become dissected in such a way that we've lost a grip on what real death is. Acceptable death becomes quite simply a death that can be tolerated by the survivors. The appropriate expression of grief and emotions is not public anymore. We want people to mourn and grieve in private, and we want them to do it over a short period of time. We think individuals should move on from the death of a person and get over it, because we think that to keep death hovering around like that is going to bring with it pollution. It's going to bring with it destruction, and we don't want that. And so we want it to be like almost a fast food way of dealing with the loss of the person. Get over it, do it in private, and then kind of continue on with your daily activities. Funeral rituals themselves have become more private, to the extent now that burials are often only attended by close family members, if they are attended by family members at all. It seems to be a trend now where a lot of individuals don't even go with the body of the deceased individual to the cemetery for the burial. They might go there afterwards and visit the grave, after a couple days. So once the the grave itself has been filled in and the false grass has been put down. And so they don't want to see the messiness of death. They don't want to see the reality of the death. They want to have this sanitized version of it. And part of that comes from the fact that death is unfamiliar to most of us. Many individuals have never experienced death. They've never been around when anyone has passed away. And so it's so foreign to us that it's unbelievable, right? We don't think that it really exists or that it can, in fact, occur. You know, we don't want to, literally, as Woody Allen would say, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And this fits in with Philip Aries' understanding of our current state of death in terms of it being forbidden or it being invisible to all of us. All right, so the last thing that I really want to look at, I've put these terms up for you guys to look at on your courses. It's by the lecture outline. I'm not going to go through them right now, but you might hear me using these words in the next section here. So I want you guys to just kind of be familiar with them. I'm just going to skip ahead to looking at the roadside memorials themselves. And so roadside memorials are initially memorial to the loss of life of a person or of individuals. And they initially often speak to the personality or the individual traits of the person who has passed away. What happens with roadside memorials, as often happens with funerals as well in the symbolism, is that they start to shift from being focused on the individual to being focused on aspects of the community. So fitting in with what Durkheim and Hertz are talking about, they become areas where we can express social belonging, social cohesion. I can express myself as being a moral member of this community because I've gone, I've left an offering, I've participated in this ritual, in this tribute to this individual who is no longer with us. So what we're going to do, or what you can do, difficult to kind of do online, but this is something that you can think about. So I want you guys to look at the graves and the roadside memorials and try and figure out something about the culture, try and understand or to pull out whether or not any kinship roles are being expressed in the items that are left there and the tributes that have been left there. See if you can tell the gender of the individual, again, through the headstone, through the flowers, through the items that are left there. See if you can tell what age the person was when they were passed away. And of course, ask yourself, if you're, guessing at an age, how is it that you knew the age of that person? And see if there's anything else you can read from the roadside memorials as well. So when you're looking at a roadside memorial or a gravesite like this, what age do you think this person was? So you're going to look to the items that have been left there. You're going to pull out information about, toys. There's some things that look very kind of childlike there. You can see that there's been a passing of seasons, but not too much time has passed since the individual has died, because you're still seeing the fresh dirt with the I love you written into the dirt itself. And so this one is the grave of a 3-year-old child. A little bit difficult to pull out the gender, although if you pay close attention, you'll notice that the roses on the left hand side are blue, and if you can zoom in on it, you'll see kind of expressions of more kind of masculine offerings being left at the grave itself. So here's an example as well. How old do you think this individual was when they passed away? Do you have an idea how it is that they passed away? So what things are you going to look at? We don't have a lot of information with this one. You can guess the season. You can guess what time of the year it is. So you're going to look at the type of flowers that were left. Obviously, there's a little bit of snow on the ground there. You're going to look to carvings on the headstone. So we have the boxing gloves, we have the guitar, and I'm going to assume that many of you would say that this individual was male, and you would be absolutely correct in that. Hard with this one to pull out how the person had passed away. It was a vehicle accident, drinking was involved in it, and the age of the person, they were 22 years old. Now with this one, again, guess the gender of the person, the approximate age of the person. You should, in theory, be able to figure out the type of accident or how this person passed away. So we have an example here of a roadside memorial. The person passed away due to a driving accident. The final report said that icy road conditions were the cause, but of course rumors swirled around that there were substances that were being used and that drinking may have played a factor in it as well. The gender of the individual, kind of hard to pull out of this, but I think some of you are getting hopefully the impression that it is a male who had passed away, and the individual in this example was 17 years old and was also a member of the Juggalo family. And if you don't know what a Juggalo is, by all means Google it, get an idea. But the way you could have known that is by seeing the clown mask on the cross itself hanging there, and that is a very good clue. And in this case, it was the truth. This person was a member of the Juggalo family. And so this will be the last one that we will look at here. And so this is an individual, obviously again a little bit easier to kind of guess what the accident was. So we have another vehicle accident. You can pull some clues as to the time of year, where we have the poppies from Remembrance Day being placed on the tree itself. People wrote little messages to the individual, placed it onto the tree. They later took those poppies and took them to the grave of the person. And it's rare that you see a transfer of goods from a roadside memorial out to the grave. But because this memorial was on private property, it was on the front lawn of someone's house, they did not visit and did not continue to visit this roadside memorial in the way that they might have if it had been on a highway or a back road. Now the tree itself was not part of the accident. You can see off to the left the new dirt around the power pole. The car actually went up and hit, kind of flipped and hit the power pole, and that had to be replaced. But because the pole wasn't there when they made the roadside memorial, or when they initially went to leave tributes, they used the tree instead of the pole, and then eventually moved these items out to the grave of the individual. Now if you're going to guess gender, this one would be very, very tough for you guys to pull out information. This is the grave of the person though, and this may help you get an idea as to the gender of the person. Now, as to the age of the person, you might be able to see, maybe if you zoom in on it a little bit, there is a birthday message that has been left on the middle bottle of Pilsner. Very common with people who have passed away at a younger age, to have individuals who go out and they'll have one beer for themselves and leave a beer at the gravesite of a loved one. So that the person can kind of participate in the consumption or in the continuation of the partying and, you know, just the lifestyle. And so we have these beer bottles being left on the grave there for the individual to celebrate their birthday. This individual was 18 when they passed away. The beer bottle was there to celebrate, I think it was their 19th birthday. And you might notice, and you can see how you can get these conflicting things that can occur during funerary tributes and rituals, is the pink bracelet right beside the hot sauce, which is right by the beer bottles there. The pink bracelet is actually Mothers Against Drinking and Driving. And so you have this conflict occurring where people are acknowledging, you know, this death was preventable, this death maybe should not have happened. And then you have his friend group who are still kind of growing and learning and making mistakes. And so this does become an area for people to reconstruct their own narratives, to reconstruct the biography of the person, and just to have a better understanding of kinship. This example here, I think many of you will be able to pick up that this one is from November, Remembrance Day. After Remembrance Day services, people bring their poppies often to the grave of a loved one or a deceased family member who was in service and is no longer here. And so the Legion will leave flags and different tributes to mark the graves, and then the family will come up with the poppies after having attended the Remembrance Day service and leave them for them. In this case, this was a male who was in his 80s. Now, this one here is for, I think you can pull up information on this one. It's for the loss of life of 2 young children, and the other family members still go to the site, visit the site, use the bench as a place for reflection. They decorate it for the seasons, and so they'll bring Christmas ornaments, things that you would have at the household become, placed or start to be placed at the grave itself. And so kind of a transferring of the life of the family from the home into the grave as well. And this one is the roadside memorial tribute that happened for the juggler. I'm just going to zip back here. So this was for the individual who had passed away. They later did an actual kind of vigil for this individual at the tree itself. You can see some of the items that were from the previous picture there. People brought candles, they closed off the street, and they said prayers, and they had music, and everyone just kind of talked about the individual and how they were important to them. So these are very important rituals for us to participate in terms of understanding who we are, understanding how we should express ourselves as being moral members of the community, and also being able to reaffirm kind of the values that the community itself has. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of very quickly, but I find it very interesting, is that as our understanding of selfhood has changed, so too has our representations on the headstones. So in early kind of history, not even that early, but it was not that long ago, where individuals did not see themselves as standing separate from the main group, and people were resigned to their own death, and that they would remind people, remember to die, basically. And so it wasn't something to be feared, it's just something that happened. And at that time, if there was a grave marker, the grave marker sometimes may contain a skull on it, and it can be quite a menacing skull, or just kind of a stark skull, sometimes with wings, or you would get the skull and crossbones. And it was to remind you, when you walk around, you're carrying your mortality with you. You are going to die. You see, little time there with the wings on it, so letting you know time is going to pass, it's going to fly away. And so wrap up things in your life, make sure you're a good person, constantly be aware that this can end at any time. The next thing that happens as we start to reflect on the death of ourselves, death no longer affects just the individual, it's starting to affect us as well. The face is still going to be there, but instead of being this stripped down skull, we want to make it more personable. And so we want to see a little bit more flesh on it. We want it to be a little bit more relatable. And so death starts to have this personality. It shouldn't be something that's scaring us. If we're going to think about it, we want it in a softened form, not this kind of really harsh or hard to deal with form. The next thing that you're seeing here is the face becoming even softer, and the angel wings again becoming very soft as well, or the wings themselves becoming very soft and representing angels. And so we're really entering into this kind of denial of the reality of death. We don't want to think about it in the most extreme form. We want to have this softened or cushioned way of thinking about it. And the last image here is what we see quite often on headstones now, is the winged cherub. And many people don't know that the death head, the skull, actually is the early form of the cherub. So as our understandings of the individual has changed, our understanding of our connection to society has changed, and also as we moved into this kind of denial of death where it's forbidden and seen to be invisible, we've transformed the symbols that we've used in order to memorialize death or in order to represent death to us. All right, and that takes us to the end of the lecture on death, society, rituals, and beliefs. Thank you.